My name is RTGreene, and I'm going to explain 40 years of research for you in the next few minutes. I'm going to do it rapidly first, and then I'm going to come back and do it in a little bit more detail. There are 13 sections, more or less chronologic, and each section has 5 points. Each of the points, total of 65 of them, could be a journal article, plus a book, plus someone's doctoral dissertation that I advise, plus a venture business for most of them, plus a course developed and taught. So 65 courses are here, 65 venture businesses are here, 65 doctoral dissertation advisements are here, 65 books are here, and 65 articles are specified. Whether I'll get all that done, whether they're all equally important, that's a matter of exigency. But here we go. The first 2 rows, 5 each, concern upping mental performance. A word on why this happened first in my research life. I got very, very high grades my second term freshman year at MIT, more than 50 points above class average. And that surprised my professors, but it also surprised me, and well, it irritated because I had no idea how I had done that. And I saw a few other people, then and then many other people later who also achieved very high performance, and they didn't know how they did it either. We all did effort, but the specific things we tried to do, we couldn't link to our performance. And so it was a mystery. High performance was a mystery, my own at first, and then other people's. And I wanted to figure out what high mental performance is based on. The president of MIT, as an undergraduate when I went there, announced in our very first week in a speech that we had talent. And I felt that was a dangerous and misleading and unfounded by research statement. I knew in my case it was probably not talent. It was probably hard work and a lack of alternative places to invest my time. And I met a lot of other students through the years where similar things were true. So I didn't believe the talent story for a minute. And later, when I studied the history of Western civilization, the history of Christianity, Descartes, the Enlightenment, Renaissance, I realized that there were strong biases in Western civilization for the talent story. So much so that psychology for many years investigated only the talent basis of intelligence in professional practice, which Erickson and the artificial intelligence software people introduced into psychology against their will. That story was never voluntarily researched by psychologists. It was only researched by them after they got pressure from software people from Carnegie Mellon and MIT and Stanford. So that's sort of the context for the upping middle performance. Now here are the 2 rows. One row is correcting neurotic narrowness in professions, in disciplines of knowledge, in experts, and in the kinds of things people are willing to call a solution to a situation. The second one, a row of 5, is called inventing intellectual tools. And the idea is once you get clear about how to correct for neuroses, what the neuroses are, then you can design certain intellectual tools where the tools do a bit of automatic protecting of you from those same neuroses. Now let's go to the neuroses 5. The 5 of them are replace incompetent ancient interfaces. And I'm talking about interfaces 8,000 or more years old, like prose. Replace prose. And I've done that in several of my books, a new way of writing. I'm going to invent a new word processor, hopefully, for that. And replace meetings as we do them now. And replace casual hallway ways of discussion as we do it now. Those are each, meetings, discussions, and prose, extremely ancient interfaces, very badly designed, that need to replace. The next one is measuring cultures, getting scientific about the effect and the dimensions and the appearance and the management of cultures. This is something where the CEOs who happen to be pretty intelligent CEOs of technology companies with PhDs, etc., who otherwise are very bright men, end up looking completely uneducated and stupid, losing tens of billions of dollars of money for their investors because they expect people in France to have lunch without wine, because they make parking places in giant parking lots the size of cars that don't exist in Europe. Because they bring a piecework pay system to Europe, then build factories based on it before they bother checking to find out that such payment systems are illegal in most of Europe. So huge mistakes are made in culture by otherwise intelligent people. So there's a blind spot or something totally missing in their education system needs to be filled. Measuring social index levels. This is the mystery that the workplaces of the world, if we go to someone's room privately and just view it for 5 minutes, we can make better predictions about their values and what they will do and their choices than we can if we work with them for all day, every day, for a week, for a year. So the knowledge and the use of knowledge of people's interests, needs, and capabilities we get from working together is minimal. And the devices for more connectivity and more interaction and more collaboration that all these technology companies push have minimal, not to say negative, impacts when measured on the amount of interests, needs, and capabilities of other people around us we know, and on the amounts of them we actually use and respond to. So if we start measuring these effects, well, then we can distinguish technologies that actually increase social indexing levels and from ones that don't, or that decrease it. This is important. Why? Because high-performance teams tend to have high social indexing levels, particularly over 20%. So the members of the team will know and use knowledge of over 20% of the interests, needs, and capabilities of the people around them. Whereas ordinary businessmen and corporations tend to operate on less than 7% of the knowing and using information on less than 7% of the interests, needs, and capabilities of people around them. Now, establishing new media industries. There are several of them I would like to deal with, and one of them, of course, is publishing readings, an industry where we can publish readings. The biggest block to that is a thing called derivative work copyright law. And if you improve the naming of points and the ordering of points and numbering of points in what you read, then you're not actually, according to case law, violating derivative work copyrights. And so there are certain readings that improve while preserving a great deal of what's there that are protected from that. And I want to create an industry of publishing those readings so that we can have expert and classic readings of a text published along with the text. I would like to see, for example, the 25 best readings in history of Melville, the 25 best readings in history of Shakespeare's Hamlet. We haven't been able to do that because of old copyright laws for a long time. Then there's another one called informative video. If you close your eyes and watch most of the video documentaries in the world, you get more than 97% of the points of the video. So the video is merely decorative. It's not really informing us. I'm designing new kinds of video where the video does informative jobs that can't be done orally. Then I'd like the fifth one under correct neurotic narrowness is expand the scale that mental operators, ordinary mental operators in our minds, expand the scale they operate on. So instead of a mental operation that you and I commonly use operating on 5 ideas in 10 minutes, I want to get it to operate on 50 ideas in 10 minutes with the same quality of treatment of each idea. Now, I've been doing this for 40 years and I've got things that work. So I've got tools that do that. That brings us down to my next 5, which are invent new intellectual tools. These 5 are response stratifications and response-to-response matrices. These are ways to handle emotion. Response stratification separates like a chromatograph their instant first reaction from our second associative reaction from our third decisional reaction layer in the events or the movies or the people, the encounters we have in life. Stratifying an encounter and then asking for members of a group who experience the same event to share noticings, to share feelings from noticings, to share sense of segmentation in the event, to share associations from the event from their different backgrounds, to share different tendencies to decide based on their experience of the event, changes in their propensity to say and do things in the future from that. Those stratifications, when brought out and made public shared with each other, allow far more interaction and understanding of each other, increase the social indexing level in effect. The response matrices are when we take an action into a group setting, the reactions of people to our action change the environment for our second planned action, so that the response to our second planned action, which we planned as if it were in the same environment of our first action, tend to be different. And we end up moving wayward from our goal. And so planning responses to our actions and responses to those responses will allow us to make plans that actually eventuate as opposed to ones that are undermined by second order and system effects. Number 2, structural cognition and cognitive list limit expanders. Structural cognition is reading and hearing and writing and speaking configuration, structural configurations of ideas instead of single ideas. A huge difference in productivity and rank in society based on whether you cognitively work structurally or not. This was the biggest discovery I had about my own mental performance in school. Unconsciously, without anybody directly teaching me, I had learned to think and read and write structurally. And nobody had taught me that. And I wanted to see now, here I am decades later, whether I can take ordinary people, train them in structural cognition, and get them to do superb world's top college levels of performance. Then cognitive list limits, if you look at different societies, as far as I know, I'm the only one in the world who's done this research. If you look in the world at 1,000 times a day when people look at alternatives and generate alternatives, like where to eat tonight and what I could be doing Saturday and what's wrong with that engine, and what do you think about John's remarks? In some societies, everyone will typically offer 3 comments or alternatives. In other societies, people will often 5, in others 7. And you can imagine that the societies where people typically 1,000 times a day offer 7 alternatives end up with slightly more variety and slightly more detail in their thinking overall than people who offer 3 or 4. And I want to research that. Social automata and social indices. Social automata are new ways to meet together, new ways to discuss, inspired by computation, where you use assigned people, cognitive or emotional roles, for intermediate inputs from other people. And the people are arranged in configurations, maybe a pair here, a pair here, a pair here, or a team here, a team here, a team there, and then paths of passing intermediate results in these configurations, and you can adjust the paths based on the quality of what's coming along in mid-process or end-process, and then you accumulate iterative results by giving everybody 5 minutes in which to do a certain operation that they are assigned to the intermediate results that they get. These are called social automata. There are millions of them. This whole space is not explored. A few workshops have a few versions of these, but there are millions of versions no one's tested, and we haven't looked at the whole space. I want to map that. I want to see how much more productive I can make people than they are in ordinary meetings. The fourth one here is regular fractal multigranular models. I've invented an interface called fractal concept models. And this is an old categorical model, like we were building in Europe in the 1700s and the 1800s by going all over the world, collecting all the rocks, collecting all the butterflies, collecting all the forms of iPad, collecting all the forms of smartphone. We've stopped publishing categorical models in academic journals because it's considered inferior, easy, trivial work. And we do causal models knowing only some of the variety in a field. And that makes a lot of our causal models trivial. It's bad science. Our journal editors have done that to help tenure. Our professors have sought it in order to get tenure, and we're distorting truth and science by doing that. I want to go back to categorical models. I want to build fractal forms of them. The nice thing is, if I have fractal variables in an equation for a system, or a model of a system, I can operate at the level of 4 variables for something, or 16, or 64, and then adjust tunable level of granularity based on whether I need really detailed guidance as my result, or whether I just need general way to go for my result. Number 5 here is called mass learning events, mass research events, mass design events. Very early in my career at an NGO, I participated in an NGO that did mass workshops. They didn't have good theory for how they did that. And so I went to cognitive linguistics, artificial intelligence, management, the history of meetings and discussions, the cognition of meetings, and looked at creating a valid research basis for such mass workshops, and tweaked the design and organization of them, and then tried them out over the last 40 years with consulting clients, and came up with some things that worked very well. This NGO created what's called in a problem-solving unit that was the basis of the General Electric workout. Now, my 3-day workouts are a good bit more professional, a good bit more accurate, a good bit better sequenced than those GE workouts are, and they get better results. And I've got lots of forms of them that I haven't had a chance to do, and I want to do in the future. Now let's go to the next section, which is again 2 different rows of 5. It's called novelty sciences. I did a lot of software expert system building of designers, and I kept seeing meretricious, shallow models of creativity and design in the computer science literature, lauded and praised and given awards and all that, and people getting tenure on the basis, but the laughable models of creativity in computer science journals, well supported with expert software. And I thought, we're not going to make progress taking amateur models of creativity and then expertly supporting them with great software. We need to have models of creativity as expert and wonderful as the software systems to support it are. And then I also noticed that creativity was at least as much detachment, disengagement, isolation as it was connection. But technology companies have a bias because they only know technologies for connection. And so they ignore the isolation part, and we end up drowning everybody with connection, and I think reducing world levels of creativity by doing that. And I've been able to measure that effect, and it's significant. Not only that, Gallagher, in her book Intellectual Teamwork from LEA in 1993, published product development team studies that showed the same. Destruction of the quality of concept development by too much connection early in product development and too much use of computer, email, and collaboration systems. So all these technology companies need to be pushing pulsed systems, not connection-only systems. And that's something I'll get to later, pulse systems. There's two rows here, the sciences of the new and making a science of design. Now, the sciences of the new are creativity. Now, here's something interesting. I went to a conference, the first global conference from the Design Society on design creativity in Kobe, 2010 in November, I think, or early December. And everybody there, 150 people, presented a single model of creativity in some way to support it or apply it. And I was the only one there who presented 60 models of creativity. And I had a German professor, I had a couple of Brazilian professors, I had an American professor criticize me for having more than one model of creativity as bad science. And this is what I mean about categorical model building as an initial step before you do causal models. Everyone was acutely uncomfortable that creativity might be 60 diverse things, not one thing. And to make it one thing, you have to have such general, vapid variableness that people fall asleep listening to your equation. The environment and social support and resources. Yeah, if that's the model of creativity, but take away creativity as the result and put practically any other human endeavor in civilization would fit that pattern, that bunch of general variables just as well. Bicycles would fit it just as well. So I think there's some really bad science going on. There's some prejudices within our academia that one giant abstract general model is good, even if you get generality at a cost of being so unbelievably abstract that it's practically worthless to everyone in history. I don't believe that. So I went out and I asked creative people how they create, and I looked and categorized very carefully what they did and found out they created in 60 different ways. I do the same thing now for system effects. I went to product development managers, I went to political leaders, I asked them when they've been surprised by the results of their actions, what kind of surprises they faced, found 256 kinds of system effects. Did the same thing with models of innovation. Found out 45 models of innovation are out there, although any one company is doing 3 or less of them. That's very interesting. Did the same thing with sources of entrepreneurship. Found out there's 64 different sources of venturing and entrepreneurship. It's not created by any one set of global factors. Now you can make some vapid equation with resources and parental effects and things so vague that, yeah, parental effects, that will make you an entrepreneur. But what good does that do, parental effects? Which parental effects? In what society? Design approaches. I went out and asked designers how they design and found out, again, a variety instead of one way. Silicon Valley venture founding, 420 dynamics. Dynamics of the venture itself as a vehicle, of the venture valley, the tech cluster as a vehicle, the ride, characteristics of the ride of those early years of creating the venture. It's an emotionally rough ride. Characteristics of the kind of product that allows you to make a successful venture, and then characteristics of the dangers of all of that. Then finally, natural selection dynamics. Ultimately, the most creative process in the universe is natural selection. It created the most sophisticated product in the universe, human beings. And ultimately, our common understanding of natural selection is dead wrong. It is not survival of the fittest in general, especially in sexual populations. And therefore, as Nowak showed, in fact, that sexual selection can cause fitness of an overall population to gradually decline. So I think before we start making metaphors of products competing via natural selection in markets, or ventures competing via natural selection within firms or within venture valleys, that we have to actually clear out our understanding of what natural selection actually is in biology and use a sophisticated version of natural selection for our metaphors instead of a wrong amateurish version that's that will lead us astray. Then the second line here is make a science of design. First of all, this involves mapping 64 approaches to design, finding the variety of the ways people design out there. Not of the varieties of things they design, the varieties of ways that apply across those things. Then express those design approaches as different combinations of different ones of my 60 creativity models. It turns out that the singularities in design processes, the imponderable points where the design process greatly slows down, stops, or changes direction, those singularity points are where more than one creativity model appears as possible, and the designer has to figure out which way to be creative, or which way, or whether he needs to be creative or not at that next segment of the design process. The third part here is event, interface, info, and extended mind design. And this is very interesting to me. This is like replacing classes in schools with events. I think intense 3-day learning events are with real research in the real world, and making your own book in 3 days, 500-page book made by 20 people in 3 days, a well-edited book as opposed to just a first draft, and doing that in 3 days and getting outside experts to help you edit it. Doing all that in 3 days is a tremendous productivity and learning and intensity experience, and much better than most classes we teach. Interface design. Replacement for prose, replacements for meetings, replacements for discussions, and then actually using these interfaces for work, and then making design improvements, experiments to get improvements in those designs. Information design, like the fractal concept model that was one of my tools, going beyond that to further fractal models. Extended mind design. Our intelligence, many anthropologists tell us, is not in our brain, but in the tools outside of our brain that extend, because our brain has a very narrow doorway into it and out of it. And what's in our brain is not very well indexed by concept or human society function. So we know something, but often we can't retrieve it, and not in time. And therefore, rather than trying to make our intelligence based on our brain, what people actually do is the questions they can answer tomorrow or how we judge their intelligence. So the boss will come today and say, here's the problem, tell me tomorrow how many machines we can sell in Brazil next year. And I've got 12 to 20 hours to figure that out using my extended mind, my library, my files, friends I have around the world who are smart people I can call or email. And so it's that extensions of our mind. We ought to school that, and we don't. We ought to have schools that grade our extended mind quality every year and improve it, but they don't. I'll get to that later. The fourth one here is a science of art as a design foundation. I was interested in being scientific about art itself, and so I asked 150 great artists, what was it about art that art did for them in their life? And 150 people who nominated themselves as greatly affected by art, what art did and contributed to their life. And then I categorized tens of thousands of those answers, and I came up with 64 functions of all arts that are shared by all arts. And I did this across 41 nations, 63 different kinds of art. And that 64 functions of all art I'm now using to predict auction prices of works and to predict greatness of a work of art historically. If you include and enact more of those functions, the interesting thing is a work of art created in 1500 in Europe at the time may have enacted in the population viewing it 20 of those functions. And then 200 years later it may have enacted 5 of those functions. And then 300 years later it may have enacted 30 of those functions. And then when moved across the ocean to America it may have enacted 32 of those functions. And so the greatness of a work of art, and measured in terms of how many of these functions of all arts are enacted by it, can vary depending upon its interaction with particular times and eras and audiences. That's fascinating research because I can use it to predict auction prices. I can use it to tell an artist in mid-work what changes in the work might make it greater in history. Then last, biosense replacing mechanosense. I did a research literature of about 200 of the hardest books on biology from Harvard and Stanford graduate courses in biology about 6 years ago, and found 83 kinds of information system in living systems. So we have this information theory of the universe in physics. We have this idea that the universe is basically, like Wolfram says in his book, a digital computer with an analog set of smooth-looking phenomena on top of that, but when we get small at the Planck level, the digitalness of the universe shows through. And then you get the idea that the information system of everything is really fitting this idea of biology as the next big science. Harvard's got 3 biology departments but 1 physics department. MIT has 3 biology departments but 1 physics department. So the Cold War and nuclear war wasn't enough to create 3 physics departments. But the richness of biology is so great, and the promise of it for humankind, that 2 of our greatest universities have 3 departments in it each. So biology is the coming sense, the dominant science for the next 100 years. You add ecology, global warming to that, and we have a lot of biological work on the macro scale, as well as stem cells on the lower scale to deal with. So my project there is changing and measuring how policies and institutions and practices are either biosense based and based on biosense and furthering it, or they're mechanosense based and moving us away from the sense of the future, scientific common sense of the future. Now I'm going to look at the next 2 rows of 5 each. This is called improving science, improving existing sciences. The first row of 5 is improving and extending science, and the second row of 5 is inventing new sciences. The first row, improving extended science. We have to make sciences more developmental. Now, this is such simple things as Edith Penrose's old book on developmental economics, 40 years later being discovered by men in economics who ignored her at the time, and then suddenly they realized 40 years later in the year 2000 they needed developmental aspect of economics. How could you develop economics for 100 years and not be developmental? I think only men are that stupid. But Edith Penrose, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, had written a book on it, and they discovered it later, that developmental economics had been pioneered by a woman that everyone ignored. But there are a lot of other sciences that are non-developmental that need to be developmental. Part of it is, one of the reasons I'm interested in natural selection is using natural selection correctly understood as a launch pad for re-looking at various sciences developmentally. The next one is extending the boundaries of science. And this is things like a science of culture, a science of art, a science of error, a science of brain biases, a science of chance, a science of risking, a science of surprise, a science of attention, a science of fame and performance. We can be scientific about those things. We have the tools, we have the fMRI studies, we have social neuroscience. We've got a whole set of knowledge and tools and concepts now that can be used to treat these phenomena scientifically. Correct narrownesses of science. This is, how do I say, the world, according to Herbert Simon's old book, Sciences of the Artificial, is naturally developing by specializing new fragments of knowledge, and so the subfields proliferate, and then the subfields proliferate, and the subfields proliferate. And you go to the annual conference of the American Psychology Association, the annual conference of the Artificial Intelligence Association, and people in one subfield have no way at all of understanding people in another subfield. So most of the entire field is not literate. People are not literate in their own field anymore. And then you have all of the problems of society that amount to anything, crossing dozens and dozens of fields. And so we have this coincidence that we are generating narrow people, narrow disciplines, narrow dissertations, and then all of our problems come from broad stuff. Somebody has to change to make tools for thinking broadly without being a dilettante, for being deep and broad both, and those are the tools I'm trying to develop. Correct the narrownesses of science by tools for being responsibly and intellectually deeply broad, like fractal concept models, for example. Then countering evil power and the erosion of scientific common sense. The elites in history, if you read history thoroughly, elites in history can create such income inequality that the people that they are different than smell bad to them, dress bad to them, talk bad to them, and they end up despising their own population. And you can see this left over in England and British universities. You can see this left over in France and French movies about French 1800s, 1700s. This despicable aristocracy who themselves stole all the money from these people and then hates and has contempt for them after they make them poor. We can do better than that, and we need to be very careful in our own time, those people who want to get elites to pull away until they despise the people they've pulled away from, and then split society for hundreds of years into a dying elite and a poor population that's ruinous and dominated by fascists and populists. We are seeing the erosion of common sense when the elites in the northeast of the United States created such income equality via Wall Street that now they lost their hold on the South. And now these less educated people in the South are entering American politics and polarizing American politics into a populist, fascist voice and an anti-elite voice. And you see that kind of European sickness that America was actually created to liberate people from reappearing in America in our lifetime. So this is huge. We need tools for that. And part of that is tracing back into brain biases, gender biases, rutted thought thinkings, mystification in the way we train doctors and MBAs, where we hide the evil greed programs within elite institutions and elite disciplines and elite careers. We demystify what they mystify. We show the doctor where he's in it just for money and how it distorts his research agenda. We show the MBA how he's in it just for himself and how at every point he undermines the group for the sake of his own career. We start measuring these effects again. Then new kinds of data and new means of collecting data. The internet not only gives us access at very low cost, but it gives us biases that are yet unmeasured and modified.